didn't get up. He was lying beside me, in our bed, and his breathing was turning into a gurgling, ragged sound I will never forget. He said my name. Twice. He didn't scream it. He rasped it into the darkness, as if it were the last anchor he could hold on to. And I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, counting his breaths. Each one was quieter than the last. In that silence, I wasn't burying him. I was burying myself. And it was a conscious decision. The newsroom smelled of stale coffee and old paper. Evelyn Harper knew the scent. It was similar to the library, but there it was mixed with the smell of bookbinder's glue and something faintly, indefinably sweet. Here, there was nothing sweet. Just coffee, the hum of printers, and the weight of other people's deadlines. She had checked the watch on her wrist back at the car. A habit, not anxiety, simply a matter of order. She walked in at 10 o'clock sharp. There were about 7 people in the newsroom, most of them staring at screens. A young man at the far end of the room, dark blonde hair, sleeves rolled up, was typing rapidly without looking up. Evelyn walked between the rows of desks, her pace even and unhurried. She felt a gaze on her back, then it turned away. She stopped in front of his desk. He looked up. Brown eyes, a flicker of irritation from a man interrupted mid-sentence. "Miss?" he said. "Mrs.," Evelyn corrected. "Harper. Evelyn Harper." She removed her right glove, deliberately, finger by finger, and placed it next to his notepad. The printers whirred. A phone rang somewhere in the back. Evelyn didn't rush. She said the words she had been rehearsing for weeks, without a tremor, without a dramatic pause. "I killed my husband in October of 1978. The printer kept whirring, but the room had grown a little quieter, the way it does when several people stop moving at once. Daniel Reed wasn't moving either. He just stared at her. There was no fear in his eyes, only that professional pause she knew was followed by assessment. It was precisely his gaze she had expected. Behind the glass partition of an office, a man with silvering temples rose from his chair. Daniel Reed pressed the record button on his tape recorder. It was an old model, scuffed at the edges. "Please repeat that." Evelyn repeated it, the same words, the same tone. "The doctor recorded heart failure," she added. "The call was made. He came." "The police?" "No." "An autopsy?" "It wasn't performed." "Witnesses?" "There were only the 2 of us in the house." Reed leaned his elbows on the desk. His gaze remained unchanged, focused, slightly narrowed. He was jotting things in his notepad, even with the recorder running. "Tell me about the moment itself." "I chose not to save him," Evelyn said. Reed looked up. "That's not a description. That's an evaluation. How, exactly, did it happen?" Evelyn laced her fingers in her lap. Her left pinky finger curved slightly to the side, something she'd long grown accustomed to. "At night, he started to gasp. I didn't get up." "How long did it go on?" "I don't remember exactly." "Did he say anything?" "He said my name. Twice." Reed wrote it down. Evelyn watched his hand, a fast, careless script filled with abbreviations. He wasn't treating her like she was crazy. That was good. "So there was no active measure taken," he finally formulated. "Nothing at all." "I didn't get up," Evelyn confirmed. "Richard called for me, and I made the decision to stay where I was." Reed capped his pen, then uncapped it. "Legally speaking, that's an omission," he said slowly, as if thinking aloud rather than speaking to her. "It's not the same as—" "I know what the law is," Evelyn interrupted softly. "I spent 32 years in a library. I've read enough." Behind the glass partition, the editor was already walking toward them. Michael Graham closed the blinds. Evelyn had noticed that while she waited in the main room, Reed had gone into the office and they had spoken for about 4 minutes. She hadn't tried to read their lips. She just sat straight, her hands in her lap, one glove off, one on. When Reed came out, his expression was professionally neutral, but his shoulders were a little tight. "I need to request the official documents," he said. "Death certificate, insurance records. The editor won't approve the story without them." "Of course," Evelyn said. "That will take some time, a few days maybe." "I have time." Reed looked at her as if expecting something more: frustration, objections, fear of the legal fallout. Evelyn gave him none of it. "Why have you come forward now?" he asked. "After 45 years. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. The question was predictable. "Because 45 years is long enough to be sure of a decision," she answered, "and long enough to begin to doubt it." Reed opened his notepad to a fresh page. The city archives occupied the ground floor of the old courthouse. The air inside was dusty and damp, nothing like the library. Evelyn knew this from her own visits back in the 70s when she was filing the paperwork for the house. Reed went without her. He returned in an hour and a half, sat across from her, and placed the printed copies on the table. "The record's here," he said. "Richard Allen Harper, heart failure, October 1978. But..." He paused, not for dramatic effect, but to find the right words. "There's no certificate of cremation in the file." Evelyn's expression didn't change. She waited. "There's a note about the body being released, but no confirmation of the procedure itself." "Did the clerk have an explanation?" "He said it was lost when the archive was moved. In the 90s, they relocated twice. It sounds plausible." "It sounds plausible." Evelyn filed the phrase away. Plausible didn't mean true. "Richard was an insurance agent," she said. "Have you called them?" "That's my next step." She nodded. Reed was staring at the printout, but his gaze was distant. He was already thinking ahead. The archivist, Thomas Becker, spoke as if every word required written approval. Evelyn wasn't present for the call. Reed described it to her later, sitting with his notepad at her kitchen table. She'd made him a cup of tea that he never touched. "The file is closed," Reed recounted, "but the policy number was reactivated a few months after the date of death." "Is that possible?" "According to procedure, no. Technically, yes, if there was a system error." He blamed outdated records and suggested I file an official request. "You should," Evelyn said. "Already did. The response will take 1 to 2 weeks. But there's something else." Reed turned a page in his notepad. "The signature of the insurance payout beneficiary. It doesn't match yours. It's a different handwriting." Evelyn glanced down at her own hand. The knuckles were smooth, a slight tremor, age, not fear. Her signature had always been small, written with a light touch. "The payout was minimal," Reed added. "Much less than the standard amount." "Richard knew insurance inside and out," Evelyn said. "He knew how policies were written, what was standard and what wasn't." Reed studied her. "You're not surprised," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I've been thinking about that night for 45 years, Evelyn replied. "It's hard to surprise me anymore." The old house stood on Cedar Street, a few blocks from her current address. She rarely drove past it, deliberately choosing other routes. The current owners, a young couple who had moved in 2 years ago, were on vacation. Reed had arranged to get a spare key from a neighbor. Evelyn stood before the front door, taking her time. "Ready?" Reed asked. "I was the one who suggested this trip," she reminded him. Inside, it smelled of strangers. Someone else's soap, a new carpet, fresh paint. But the layout was the same. Evelyn didn't need a tour. She walked down the hall, past the kitchen, and stopped at the bedroom door. The furniture was different now. The walls were painted beige, but the window was in the same place. Evelyn walked to the center of the room. "The bed was here," she said. "The headboard against this wall. The nightstand was to the right of it. There was a glass of water and an alarm clock on it." Reed was taking pictures. A click, then another. He documented the light switch by the door, the distance to the hallway. "The phone was in the hall?" he checked. "On a small telephone table. They don't make them like that anymore, with a little drawer for the phone book." "A few steps from the bed to the phone." 5, Evelyn said. "I counted them later, many times." Reed lowered his camera. He was watching her, not with pity, but with an attention that was better. "He called out to you." "Twice. In his normal voice, not a shout. It was hoarse." "And you didn't get up?" "I lay there and listened to him breathe. And then his breathing changed." She replayed the path in her mind, from the bed to the phone. 5 steps, across the cold floor, over the wooden planks that always creaked by the doorway. "I chose not to save him," Evelyn said. It was the 3rd time she had said it today. The same words, but here, in this room, they carried a different weight. The breath caught in her throat, sharp and without warning. Evelyn hadn't expected it. She had prepared for this visit, mentally, methodically, the way she prepared for any difficult conversation. But her body hadn't asked if she was ready. A pressure built in her chest. The air grew thick, and her hands felt disconnected from her arms. She reached for the doorframe, but missed. Her knees buckled on their own. Reed caught her by the elbow before she hit the floor. His grip was surprisingly firm. She hadn't expected the young man with the perpetually slouched shoulders to be so quick. "Let's go," he said, his voice stripped of unnecessary words. He led her out to the porch. Evelyn sat on the wooden steps, breathing carefully, like someone who had just climbed a steep hill. She hadn't lost consciousness. That was important. It wasn't fainting, not weakness. It was something else. A reaction to the place, to the air, to the 5 steps between the bed and the phone. Reed stood nearby, not sitting, not speaking. "You don't have to look at me like that," Evelyn said once her breathing had evened out. "Like what?" "Like I'm some fragile thing. I'm looking at a person who just felt unwell. I'm fine now." Reed didn't argue. He just took out his notepad. Evelyn watched him from the side, the way he looked from his notes to the street, then back to his notes. Something in him was shifting. It had started during her story in the newsroom and continued here. He had come for a sensation. That much was obvious. But her reaction in the bedroom wasn't what you'd expect from someone with a script. "Do you believe me?" she asked. "I believe that you believe yourself," he answered. It was an honest reply. She appreciated that. Back in town, Reed spent hours with the documents. Evelyn didn't see this part of his work. She went home, brewed a cup of tea she again didn't drink, and waited. He called the next morning, his tone brief and stripped of pleasantries. "The closing date on the insurance policy," he said, without preamble. "It's 8 weeks after the supposed cremation." Evelyn simply listened, the silence on her end of the line conveying more than words could. "It could be an administrative delay," he added. "But there's another note. In one of the internal documents, it mentions a personal appearance by the client. Afterward." The silence on the line stretched on. "After the date of death," Reed clarified. "Becker said it was a technical error, a misstated form. It's possible. But combined with the reactivated policy number and the missing cremation certificate..." "It's a system," Evelyn said. "Or a system of errors. I can't say for sure yet." "But you think otherwise?" A pause. "It doesn't add up," Reed said. "Individually, each anomaly is explainable, but together, they're not." Evelyn stood and walked to the window. Cedar Street wasn't visible from here. There was only the old poplar by the neighbor's fence, a silent witness she had watched for 45 years. "You think he didn't die," she said. It wasn't a question. Reed didn't answer right away. When he spoke, his voice was even, but it held a new note of caution. "I think the official story of Richard Harper's death is incomplete, and that your confession might be based on a premise that needs to be verified." Evelyn held the receiver with both hands. Her hands were cold. They were always cold. For 45 years, she had carried a precisely calibrated weight. She knew its shape, its heft, its place in her life. She had stopped noticing it. It had become a part of her posture. If Richard Harper hadn't died that night, the weight wouldn't disappear. It would just become something different, something else, and possibly worse. "Keep digging," Evelyn said. The second time, Evelyn arrived without calling first. Reed was at the same desk, a stack of printouts at his elbow, his coffee untouched. He looked up, no longer surprised. He just nodded toward the chair. Evelyn sat down. She removed her gloves, both of them this time. "You wanted to know about the marriage," she said. "I wanted to know about that night." "The one explains the other." Reed opened his notepad. The tape recorder clicked on. Outside the window, a truck crawled slowly down the main street. Evelyn followed it with her eyes, not out of interest, but because she needed a second before she began. "In October of '73, she said, "Richard came home at 4 in the afternoon. He usually got home at 6. I hadn't started dinner yet." "Did he call?" "No. He stood in the kitchen doorway and asked where his meal was." "What did you say?" "That I'd have it ready in an hour." Evelyn laced her fingers. "He said, 'Fine,' and went into the living room to read. We had dinner that evening. He never mentioned it again." Reed watched her, waiting for more. "That was the point," Evelyn said. "He never raised his voice. He never demanded an explanation. He just asked questions. And every question had a layer underneath, a subtext I learned to hear." "What kind of subtext?" "Evaluation." She said the word flatly, like a fact from an encyclopedia. "You are loyal to me, aren't you?" That wasn't a question about loyalty. It was a test of my reaction. If I answered immediately, without hesitation, it was the correct response. If I paused, he made a note of it. Not aloud, inside. Reed wasn't writing. He was just listening. "If something were to happen to me, you wouldn't fall apart, would you?" Evelyn recited the phrase like a line of poetry learned against her will. "He said that 3 times in our 20 years together, in different contexts. The first time was when his blood pressure was high. The second, when a colleague died suddenly. The third was a few months before October of '78. Did you understand they were tests?" "I understood they were important questions." Evelyn tilted her head. "That's not the same thing." Reed tapped his pen on the desk. "Once. So you saw them as a form of caring." "I saw them as an obligation. Richard built our marriage on a certain kind of logic. In that logic, we each had a role, and those roles were not to be altered. My role was to be there at the critical moment. And on that night in October, you weren't there." "No," Evelyn said. "I didn't get up." She stated it without a pause, without emphasis. It was just a fact, long established, repeatedly verified, and set in its place. Reed left at lunchtime. Evelyn found out later, when he called from his car, the sound of the highway in the background. "The insurance archives," he said without preamble. "I found a funds transfer to a branch in Indiana, 2 months after the date of death." Evelyn moved her teacup to the other side of the table, a habit to free her hands for a conversation. "The amount?" "Small. Too small for a full insurance settlement." "Richard wrote his own policy." "I figured." A pause, the hum of the road. "There's a note on the transfer. Client's personal presence confirmed." Evelyn didn't answer right away. "What did the archivist say?" "That the note could have been added in error, technical glitches during the data transfer." "But the date?" "The transfer date is 3 weeks after the cremation." The teacup sat on the table, its contents cold. Evelyn stared at a hairline crack in the saucer, one she'd noticed back in the 90s sometime and had never gotten around to throwing away. "Daniel," she said, using his first name for the first time. "You understand what you're looking for." "I'm looking for an explanation for the discrepancies." "You're looking for a living man." A long pause. "Yes," he said. The next day, Reed vanished. No calls, no appearances. Evelyn spent the morning with her journal, not writing, just holding it, open to a blank page. By noon, she closed it. Around 3, she took an old envelope from a drawer, not because she was looking for it, but because it had been lying there for 20 years, maybe more. Richard's letters. They weren't romantic. Richard didn't write romantic letters. They were business-like notes, household reminders, occasional short observations. His handwriting was angular, with heavy pressure, the words marching in straight lines with no margins. She sifted through the pages slowly, not reading, just scanning. His handwriting was always the same, confident, intolerant of correction. A dateless note was tucked in the middle of the stack, a single sheet torn from a notepad. Richard had written, "Love is tested in a moment of weakness. Everything else is convenience." Evelyn read the sentence twice, then laid the paper on the table. Over the past 45 years, she had gone through these letters several times. This note had always been there. She had seen it. But before, she had read it as a detached observation, philosophical, a little cold, just like Richard. Now, she read it differently, a moment of weakness. She remembered his question. "If something happened to me, you wouldn't fall apart, would you?" The window across the room was open. A draft of autumn air slipped through the crack, stirring the corner of the note. Evelyn covered it with her palm. Richard had been lying there, gasping. He had called her name twice, and she hadn't gotten up. That was her answer to the question he had asked her 3 times over 20 years. Evelyn lifted her hand from the note. She stood and walked to the window. The poplar by the neighbor's fence was motionless, a windless day despite the feeling of a draft. She had held that night as her crime. She had built 45 years upon it. If Richard had staged the attack as a test, not staged it, of course, a heart doesn't follow a script, but if, lying there in the dark, he had managed to turn it into a test, then who exactly was being graded? She didn't call Reed. This wasn't his question to answer. Not yet. Reed returned on the 3rd day. He called at 7:30 in the morning. "The archive is closed." "Which archive?" "The Indiana branch. I drove down. There's a sign on the door, 'Archive liquidated during digitalization.' The security guard said some of the documents were written off as obsolete." Evelyn stood in her hallway in her slippers. Dawn was breaking through the window at the end of the hall. "You're disappointed," she said. "I'm busy." A pause. "It's not the same thing." "No," she agreed, "but it's close." He didn't respond to that. There are microfilms, Reed continued. The regional archivist gave me 2 hours. I'm working on it right now. You're there? In the reading room. I can't talk on the phone in here. I stepped out into the hall. Then you should go. He was already walking. She could hear his footsteps on the linoleum. From his report, compiled that evening at her kitchen table, Evelyn pieced together the sequence of events. He'd had 2 hours. He scrolled through the film by hand. The archive wasn't fully digitized, and the insurance files from the 70s were stored on reels. He found Richard's policy. The date of the last transaction on it was 6 weeks after the cremation. The policy hadn't been closed automatically. It had been closed manually, by request. The request was on a digital scan. Reed printed it out on the archive's printer, paying in cash. The text was short, requesting account closure due to a change in circumstances. The signature read, Richard Harper.
Let me see it,
Evelyn said. Reed handed her the printout. She took it with both hands, holding it up to the light over the table. The signature was Richard's. She had seen it enough to know. The angular letters, the firm line under the surname. But the slant was slightly different. Not by much, just a few degrees. And the pressure was lighter than usual. He could have signed it after the attack, she said. His hand would have been weaker. He could have, Reed said. But the date is a month after his death. Evelyn set the paper down. She sat up straighter. You found something else? Yes. He ran a hand through his hair. There's a Richard Harper in the database, same birth year, in Kentucky. That's not him. No, I called. Completely different man. 74, an accountant. Evelyn nodded. She hadn't expected it to be that easy. But then I checked the bank, Reed said. Not the insurance company. Richard's personal account. Were you a joint owner? No, he kept a separate account. He said it was more convenient for his work. 7 days after his date of death, a cash withdrawal. A branch in Ohio. Evelyn didn't move. Back then, a withdrawal required you to be there in person, Reed added. I checked. I know, she said. I used to work with people who processed those transactions. It was impossible without a personal visit. Reed looked at her. His car, he said. A black '76 Buick. It was re-registered in Ohio. A month after your... He stopped himself. After the official date of death. The VIN matches. The silence in the kitchen was thick. The clock in the living room ticked on the other side of the wall. So he left, Evelyn said. Yes. With his car, with his money, with documents that were closed retroactively. That's my theory. I can't prove it without more confirmation. Evelyn stood up. She walked to the sink, turned the faucet on, then off. Her hands were cold. They were always cold. It had nothing to do with the situation. Richard was an agent, she said, her back to Reed. He designed insurance schemes for other people for 20 years. He knew where the loopholes were. He knew what wasn't checked. He knew how to leave a note that looked like a mistake. He could have orchestrated it. Yes. After the attack, once he had survived. Yes. She turned to face him. You understand what this means? Reed looked at her, his notepad and recorder forgotten. He just looked. If he planned this, he said, then his death was a fabrication. Yes. And in that case, you didn't kill him. No. Evelyn said it without inflection. It wasn't a release, but an equation where all the numbers had finally aligned. The right answer doesn't always bring relief. Sometimes the right answer erases the problem you've spent your entire life trying to solve. For 45 years, she had carried a specific knowledge about herself. She was the woman who didn't get up, the one who chose stillness at the critical moment. It was her crime, her identity, her way of understanding her own actions. If Richard had survived that night, none of that disappeared. She still hadn't gotten up. She had still lain there and listened. But what happened afterward was his choice, not a consequence of hers. Reed didn't speak. He understood. She could see it in the way he sat. Not like a journalist with a story, but like a man who had been handed something heavy and didn't know where to put it down. "We have to find him," he said at last. "Yes," Evelyn agreed. She returned to the table. She sat down, pulled the printout with the signature closer, and looked at it again. At that slight slant, that faint pressure. Richard had written this himself, after the attack. Alive. It was undignified. Evelyn wasn't there for the phone call. She learned about it later, not from Reed's words, but from his face when he walked into the newsroom. But that came later. First, there was the evening before, when she sat at home doing nothing in particular. She sorted through the mail, which was already sorted. She moved the salt shaker from one end of the table to the other. She adjusted the watch on her wrist, though it was already keeping perfect time. Richard Allen Harper. Date of birth, April 1st, 1940. A suburban town, a well-kept house, a landline. Reed had emailed her the information. Brief, no details. Found an address. I'll call tomorrow morning. The data matches. She read it at 9:30 and closed her laptop. The data matches. She went to bed at 10. She didn't sleep. She lay on her back, arms at her sides, and stared at the ceiling. The night outside was quiet. Her neighborhood was always quiet. Not a single car passed on Cedar Street after 11. Richard had loved silence too. At the end of the day, he would turn off the radio, settle into his armchair, and open the newspaper. It meant that conversation was over. It meant the period of testing was complete. The grade had been given, the result recorded. Evelyn had learned to read those transitions. 20 years of practice. Reed called her a little after 11. His voice was steady, intentionally so, she recognized. I spoke with him. Evelyn held the phone to her ear. She was standing in the middle of her living room in her morning cardigan, not yet dressed for the day. He answered? Yes, after the third ring. And? The date of birth matches. He confirmed he used to work in insurance. A pause. When I said your name, he was silent for about 10 seconds. Then he said, Evelyn was a good wife. Evelyn didn't reply. It's him, Reed said, not a question. Yes. Would you have recognized his voice? Evelyn thought about it. Truly thought, not just to be polite. I'm not sure, she said. A voice changes in 45 years, but his mannerisms, maybe. He spoke slowly, with pauses. He chose his words carefully. It's him. She sank onto the sofa, not because she was tired, but because there was no longer a need to stand. Reed was quiet. She could hear his breathing, the faint sound of traffic in the background. He was calling from a parking lot or a street. What else did he say? I asked why he left in 78. He said, sometimes people realize they need to start over. Evelyn exhaled slowly. His exact words? His exact words. To start over. That was Richard's phrasing. His way of turning a retreat into a strategic decision. He never left. He refocused. He never lost. He re-evaluated his priorities. I asked if he knew he was officially listed as deceased, Reed continued. He said, I saw no reason to correct other people's conclusions. "That's not an answer," Evelyn said. "No, but it's a confirmation." She placed her left hand on her knee. Her wedding ring was a narrow band of gold, no stone. Richard had chosen it himself. Simplicity, he had said, was a virtue. "Daniel," she said, "when will you publish this?" A pause. "I haven't spoken with Graham about the details yet." "He'll be thrilled." "Probably." "And you?" Reed didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice held the same caution she had come to recognize. "I'd like to speak with you first. In person. Can you come to the newsroom?" She wore a dark blue suit. She ironed the collar twice because she wasn't satisfied with the first result. She put on both gloves. On the way to the newsroom, she didn't think about Richard. It was strange. For 45 years, she had thought of almost nothing else. But on the day he was found alive, she found herself wondering if she'd turned off the stove. She had. She always turned off the stove. Main Street was quiet at noon. A few cars, an elderly man with a dog near the post office, the pharmacy window displaying its autumn promotions. An ordinary day. Evelyn walked at her usual slow, steady pace. Reed was waiting for her at the entrance. He wasn't smoking or looking at his phone. He was just standing there. When she approached, he opened the door without a word. Through the glass partition, Graham watched with the narrowed eyes of a man who senses a story nearing its conclusion. Evelyn walked to Reed's desk and sat down. Reed settled across from her, his notepad closed. "You heard the most important part," he said. "Yes." "Richard Harper is alive. He's 86 years old. He's living in another state under his own name and has confirmed his identity, indirectly, but unequivocally." "I understand." Reed looked at her, his brown eyes showing a hint of fatigue. It wasn't a journalist's scrutiny. It was just a man seeing something and not being sure what to do with it. "You didn't kill him," he said. Evelyn didn't answer. "Evelyn?" The first time he'd used her name without Mrs. "You didn't kill him. He survived the attack, left of his own accord, and falsified the documents to cover his tracks. It was his decision, not a consequence of yours." She laced her fingers together. Her left pinky rested crookedly on top of the others. "I hear you," she said. Behind the glass, Graham stood, took a few steps toward his office door, and stopped. He could see they were talking. He was waiting. Evelyn took her gloves from her purse. She'd removed them when she sat down, and began to put them on, slowly, finger by finger. "I have to go," she said. "Wait." She paused, her right glove only halfway on. "I just told you that you're not guilty," Reed said. It wasn't irritation in his voice. It was a bewilderment he hadn't yet learned to hide. "You're reacting as if it's bad news." "I didn't say it was bad news." "You're putting on your gloves and leaving." "That's precisely what I was doing." Evelyn stood. "There's no connection." He stood up too, quickly, like someone who knows he's about to lose the moment. Just then, Graham opened his office door. A gust of air from the hallway, or perhaps the street as someone else entered the building, hit the main door and it swung open. A few papers from a nearby desk lifted and scattered across the floor. One landed at Evelyn's feet. Reed stepped toward the door before she could. He took her by the elbow. Evelyn pulled her arm away sharply, an unplanned, reflexive movement. "Don't you dare say he's alive." Her voice was louder than she'd intended. Not a shout, but an elevation that surprised even her. The newsroom fell silent. Several people looked up from their screens. Graham stood frozen by his office door, his arms at his sides, his expression unreadable. Reed didn't back down. He stood his ground, watching her. "He is alive," he said evenly. "The bank transaction in Ohio 7 days after his death. Personal appearance required. The re-registration of the Buick, the VIN, matches. The insurance claim with his signature a month later. He paused. I'm not interpreting. I'm listing facts. Evelyn closed her eyes. Facts. Richard had always had facts. He never raised his voice. He listed, calmly, confidently, with pauses. Dinner isn't ready. You promised it by 6. It is now 6:20. Facts, like nails. She opened her eyes. Evelyn Harper is not a murderer, Reed said. From his corner, Graham nodded, as if the statement required an editor's approval. Evelyn looked at Reed, at Graham, at the scattered papers on the floor, one of which lay by her shoe. Slowly she sank back into the chair. A long silence followed. Reed didn't rush her. It was the right thing to do, she noted, with the part of her mind that was still assessing the situation. Graham retreated to his office and closed the door, giving them space. That, too, was the right thing to do. If Richard is alive, Evelyn said at last, then I have lived my life for nothing. He opened his mouth to speak. Listen to me, she interrupted, her voice level. Not as a journalist. Just listen. He closed his mouth. He nodded. I never remarried, Evelyn said. I never left this town. I never allowed myself anything that could be considered a reward. Because a person who carries guilt has no right to a reward. That's logic. It works. Reed watched her, his expression unreadable. For 45 years, that logic has kept me in order. She said the words in order without a trace of irony. I woke up at the same time. I ate at the same time. I went to the library. I kept a journal. I maintained the house. All of it had meaning, because behind it all was a foundation. I am guilty. I carry that. But you're not guilty, Reed said quietly. Exactly, Evelyn replied. So what now? He didn't answer. It was the right response. There was no answer to give. You've brought me the news that 45 years of my life have been built on a mistake, she continued. Not a crime. A mistake of interpretation. I thought I didn't get up and he died. He didn't die. He left. Those are different things. Yes, Reed said. Fundamentally different. But the result is the same. She looked down at her hands. The right glove was half on, the left lay in her lap. I have spent 45 years playing the part of a person who did something unforgivable. That role gave me structure. It gave me bearings. A pause. Do you have any idea what it means to lose that? Reed was silent for a moment. No, he said honestly. Not completely. Evelyn appreciated that. She hadn't expected understanding from him, only honesty, and he had given it. Without the guilt, I don't know who I am, she stated, not as a complaint, but as a diagnosis. Reed offered no platitudes. He didn't say, "You're a strong woman," or "You have your whole life ahead of you." He just sat there. It was the right thing to do. Outside the newsroom window, a car drove by, followed by silence. The printer in the corner spat out a page, and no one got up to retrieve it. Without the guilt, I am no one, Evelyn repeated, her voice no softer, no louder than the first time. It was a fact that needed to be spoken again, to test its strength. Reed ran a hand through his hair, his first nervous gesture of the entire conversation. The story I was going to write, he said slowly, was about a living man, about fraud, about documents. It's a sensation. Graham would have been pleased. He would have, No, I'm not so sure. He wasn't looking at her, but past her, at the wall, at someone else's papers with someone else's notes. Because publishing this won't just turn his life upside down. It will, first and foremost, turn yours. Evelyn adjusted her left glove, a pointless motion, as she hadn't even finished putting it on. You're asking for my permission. I'm trying to figure out what's right. That's not a question for a journalist. No, he agreed. It's a personal one. Evelyn looked at him for a long, unhurried moment. A young man with a tattoo on his wrist and a notepad with dog-eared pages, 32 years old. He didn't understand 45 years from the inside, but he didn't pretend to. That made him a suitable conversationalist. Read, she said. This story changed my life the moment I walked into your newsroom. Whether you publish it or not, won't bring back my old foundation. I know. The question now is something else. What is it? Evelyn didn't answer right away. She looked at the glove in her left hand, then placed it on the table next to his notepad, next to his tape recorder. Reed stared at the glove, then met her eyes. What question? He repeated. Whether anything can remain, Evelyn said, if you take away the foundation. She didn't specify the foundation of what. He understood. Reed laid the papers out on the table without explanation. 4 sheets. He aligned their edges, not with pedantic precision, but with the casual habit of someone arranging arguments before a conversation they don't want to have. Evelyn looked at the papers without touching them. The dates, he said. She read them. October 14th, 1978. The heart attack. October 21st, the cash withdrawal in Ohio. November, the re-registration of the Buick. December, the activation of an insurance policy in another state. A clean line. Unbroken. Richard Harper didn't die, Reed said, not with the tone of discovery, but with the calm of a man stating a diagnosis aloud. Not because the other person hasn't understood, but because the words need to exist in the room. Evelyn didn't respond. She picked up the sheet detailing the bank transaction. The date in the top left corner, October 21st. 7 days. 7 days between Richard lying in bed, gasping her name, and him standing at a bank teller's window in the next state. Alive. Dressed. With money. 7 days. She placed the paper back down, exactly where she had found it. Graham watched from his office. The blinds were only half closed, but he hadn't bothered to shut them completely. Evelyn noticed his silhouette out of the corner of her eye, motionless, a coffee cup held in both hands. Reed remained silent. It was a wise choice. Questions would have been useless now. Evelyn stared at the date. October 21st. On that day, she was already wearing black. On that day, she was already accepting condolences from her downstairs neighbor, who had brought a casserole and held her hands for a long time. On that day, she was already a widow. And on that day, Richard was standing at a teller's window. A choice. Not a mistake, not an accident, not a consequence of her hesitation. It was his choice, his decision, his steps toward the bank's door. He had survived the attack and chosen to leave, not to stay. Everything that followed in her life was not a result of his death. It was a result of his desertion. For me, it was a tragedy, she said, her voice even. The attack, his death, my guilt. A pause. For him, it was a test and an opportunity. Reed didn't interrupt. He woke up alive, Evelyn continued. He saw that I hadn't jumped up immediately, and he took that as an answer. An answer to what? To the question he'd been asking for 20 years. She folded her hands in her lap. Her left pinky rested crookedly. If something happened to me, you wouldn't fall apart, would you? He heard me say I would, that I didn't love him, that he had been wrong about me. Reed watched her. And instead of asking, Evelyn said, he left. A few seconds of silence. A lamp hummed over a distant desk. Someone deep in the newsroom was speaking on the phone, a low, even, professional conversation. 45 years, Evelyn said, without emphasizing any particular word, just a number. I never remarried. I never moved away when I had the chance. I turned down my sister when she invited me to live with her in another city. I stayed here. She glanced out the window. Main Street, an ordinary day. Because a person who fails to save another has no right to an easy life. That isn't the law. It's my logic. I understand, Reed said. No. She said it without sharpness. You understand the words. You don't understand how it works from the inside. When guilt isn't a feeling, but an organizing principle. When it explains why you get up at 6, why you don't take vacations, why you never buy yourself anything extra. A pause. It's a very convenient structure, Daniel. It eliminates a great many questions. Reed was silent. Correctly so. If Richard is alive, Evelyn went on, then the structure collapses. The foundation is gone, but the walls are still standing. She looked at her hands. I have no idea what to do with walls that have no foundation. Behind the glass, Graham shifted. He set down his cup. The silence stretched, not awkward, but dense. Reed didn't try to fill it. Evelyn sat perfectly straight, her back not touching the chair, a posture her mother had taught her in childhood. Good posture shows self-respect. In the silence, something began to shift within her. She hadn't expected it, hadn't planned it, but the words she had been speaking for the last few minutes, about the structure, the foundation, the walls, were arranging themselves into a different pattern. Not the one she had walked in with 3 weeks ago. For him, it was a test. And an opportunity. She had just said it herself. Richard had been lying there, gasping, calling her name, and the moment she didn't leap up, he had drawn his conclusion. He didn't ask. He didn't wait for an explanation. He drew a conclusion and left. Evelyn remembered her pause well. For years, she had called it, the minute I chose not to save him. But what had really happened in that minute? Fear, darkness, exhaustion from 20 years of being tested. A second, maybe a few seconds, of lying still, not because she chose his death, but because she was worn out, because his voice in the dark was just one more demand, and for a fraction of a second, her body had refused to respond. Then she had gotten up. She had called for help. She had done everything right, but Richard had already made up his mind. She looked up. In that case, Evelyn said, Richard did die that night. Reed frowned. You just said he's alive. He is alive, she confirmed. Physically. But another Richard died that night. Reed watched her, waiting. The man who was my husband, Evelyn said. The one who built a marriage as a series of tests and could end it with a single decision. She glanced at the papers before her. That night, he made the decision to leave. And with that decision, he ceased to exist for me. I just didn't realize it. For 45 years. Reed wasn't writing. The tape recorder lay on the table, turned off. She had noticed that at the beginning of their conversation and appreciated it. When I didn't get up instantly, Evelyn said, he decided that was my answer. That I had told him, I don't need you. She tilted her head slightly. But it wasn't an answer, it was exhaustion. 1 second of exhaustion after 20 years of being tested. He didn't wait for an explanation. He didn't ask. Because a conversation would have meant vulnerability, Reed said quietly, almost to himself. Yes. Evelyn wasn't surprised that he understood. Richard didn't know how to be vulnerable. He knew how to be in control. Faking his departure, that's control. It's a victory without explanation. A pause. And my silence for 45 years, she added, was his final victory over me. One that I handed to him myself. Reed looked at her with an expression Evelyn couldn't immediately place. It wasn't pity, it was something more personal. He was thinking of something of his own, someone of his own. She didn't ask. A thought is not an action, Evelyn said after a moment. Reed looked up. I used to think sometimes, I wish he would die. She said it evenly. Years before that night, on particularly hard days, when his questions piled up, when his silence was a punishment, not a reprieve. A pause. I thought it, and then I hated myself for it. That's not a crime, Reed said. I understand that now, Evelyn replied. I didn't then. My mother taught me that thoughts have weight, that you are accountable for your bad thoughts. She glanced at the window. My father was silent. Silence is also a form of upbringing. But you did get up that night. You called a doctor. Yes. So the thought didn't become an action. No, Evelyn agreed. It didn't. She shifted her gaze back to the table. I just didn't recognize the distinction. To me, the pause before getting up and the thought, I wish he would die, had merged into a single event, a single crime. But they're different things. They are different things, she repeated, not as an agreement, but as a test. The words hung in the air and held their shape. Reed picked up his pen. He didn't open his notepad, just held it, a habit. His escape was his choice, he said, not a consequence of your pause. Yes, Evelyn said it without hesitation, because she had been thinking it for several minutes now, ever since she'd looked at the date, October 21st. His decision was his own. He could have come back. He could have written. He could have called a day later, a year later, 10 years later. A pause. He didn't. That was his choice, not mine. Graham silently opened his office door. He stood for a moment, then closed it again. Evelyn looked down at her hands, her dark blue gloves. She had put them on that morning automatically, as she did every day, pulling them on carefully, smoothing out the wrinkles, adjusting them at the wrist. Her right wrist. Beneath the glove was a thin scar, a cut from broken glass long ago in her youth. She had always told herself it was a mark of carelessness, a reminder. But the scar was from a shattered jar, an accident, not a symbol, just a cut. She removed her right glove. Slowly, as she always did, finger by finger, she placed it on the table. Then the left one. Reed watched, saying nothing. The fabric lay next to the papers, next to the dates, next to the proof, next to the chain of someone else's choices that she had mistaken for her own guilt for 45 years. Her hands on the table, cold. They were always cold. A slight tremor in the joints. Arthritis. Age, not fear. The scar on her right wrist was pale, almost invisible. Just hands. The ring. Narrow. Gold. No stone. Richard had chosen it himself. Simplicity, he'd said, signified constancy. Evelyn had worn it for 45 years, taking it off only to shower or cook, and not always then. She looked at it for a few seconds. The marriage had ended that night. Not when Richard decided to leave. Not when she learned the truth 3 weeks ago. It had ended that night, when she didn't jump up, and he decided that was her verdict. From that moment on, the marriage hadn't existed, only the paperwork and her belief. She slipped the ring off. A pale band of skin underneath. Skin that hadn't seen the air in 45 years. Narrow, a shade lighter than the rest. It was strange to see it, as if it belonged to someone else. The ring settled on the table beside the gloves. Reed looked at the table, then up at Evelyn. She didn't explain the gesture. He didn't ask for an explanation. Graham emerged from his office. He walked to the table and looked at the papers, the gloves, the ring. His heavy-lidded eyes were unreadable. He gave a single, slow nod and returned to his office. Reed picked up his notepad and opened it. "I'm going to write this story," he said. "Not about a husband who's alive. About 45 years of false guilt." Evelyn didn't reply. "It's more important than a sensation," he added. Not for her, but for himself, testing his own decision aloud. "Write what you feel you must," Evelyn said. She stood up. The newsroom door opened outward. The autumn air hit her at once, cold, smelling of damp leaves and car exhaust. Main Street. The same street she had walked down 3 weeks ago. The post office on the right, the pharmacy window, the old poplar at the corner, already mostly bare. Evelyn paused on the steps. Her hands were bare. The air touched her skin, her fingers, her wrists, the scar. It was cold, not unpleasant, just cold, as it often is in October. She didn't hurry. The Harper house was in the other direction, left on Cedar, 2 blocks down. She wouldn't go there, not because she was afraid, but because there was nothing left to find. Straight ahead was the same street, no particular destination, just a street. Evelyn took a step forward. The wind stirred a branch of the poplar. 2 leaves, one yellow, one brown, broke free and drifted slowly to the pavement. 1 minute in the dark, 45 years ago. 1 minute of weariness that Richard had read as an answer, and she had read as a life sentence for herself. "Sometimes 1 minute is all it takes," Evelyn said, "to stop being a widow." It wasn't loud. It was for herself, or for the street. It didn't matter. She walked down Main Street without her gloves, the October air chilling her palms. Behind her was the newsroom, the gloves on the table, the ring beside them, and a young journalist with a notepad who had chosen to write about freedom instead of a sensation. Ahead was the street, an ordinary street with poplars and pharmacy windows, familiar down to the last cobblestone. She was walking it for the first time without the weight she had mistaken for herself.